Welcome back, everybody, to the NCAA Next Up Dynasty here on NCAA Football 14. Today, we've got a pretty big episode as we go over all of the big-time award winners, including the Heisman Trophy. And most importantly, we reveal the 12 teams who will be going to the college football playoff and what their seedings will be. The awards and playoff were voted on by you guys. I received 111 ballots. Actually, originally it was 118. But I discarded 7 of them because this person only voted for Duke for the at-large playoff bids, and they only voted for Justin Tucker in the Heisman. So every single vote they put on was for Duke, and it was for Justin Tucker. To whoever did this, I know you're watching. Your plan did not work. I have caught you. But I do have some advice for you. Did you know that you can actually get paid for meat riding? All you got to do is go to Indeed.com and then type in deli. From there, you'll be able to find jobs where you can actually ride meat for free, like you've been riding Duke and Justin Tucker's meat all season long. I think the funniest part of this whole situation is that once I removed the person's 7 ballots, Duke's standing within the college football playoff did not change. Neither did Justin Tucker's standing in the Heisman voting. So you wasted your own time, and you also wasted like 2 hours of my time. So thanks a lot, goofball. I think I'm going to change it next year to where you can only vote once. So nobody better be coming up with ideas, because you ain't getting them past me. Let's go through all the big-time awards now, and we're going to start with the Heisman Trophy, the most prestigious award in college football, and ultimately there were 8 nominees up for the award. Those players are quarterback out of Ohio State, Puma Whitlock, Duke quarterback, Justin Tucker, Georgia quarterback, Aram Ketchikan, Florida quarterback, Ernie Capellar, Baylor running back, Dontavius Brown, South Alabama quarterback, Kujay Reddings, Oklahoma quarterback, Romeo Coloci, and last but certainly not least, Oregon quarterback, Barrett Cherokee. So now it's time for the moment of truth. Who did you guys vote for as the winner of the Heisman Trophy? And it ends up being Justin Tucker, quarterback out of Duke. This is not really a major surprise. Justin Tucker was fantastic this season and is 100% deserving of this award. He has been a 4-year starter with Duke. This past season as a senior, he had a passer rating of 207.5. 3,900 yards, 45 touchdowns, 4 interceptions, 73% completion percentage, and nearly 700 yards on the ground with 9 touchdowns. Justin Tucker won fairly convincingly, getting 106 total votes out of the 111, 71 of which, including my personal vote, were for him to get first place. My second place vote went to Aram Ketchikan of Georgia, and my third place vote went to Baylor running back Dontavius Brown. This is a completely deserved honor, and I think Justin Tucker this year had an even better season than the Heisman Trophy winners of the first 2 seasons of this series. The way he carried a pretty mediocre Duke team has been incredible, not just this season, but the last few seasons. Puma Whitlock ended up finishing in second. I did not put a top 3 vote on him, but he was really good this year. Dontavius Brown ended up getting third. Aram Ketchikan ended up getting fourth, which I think is a little low. I think he should have finished higher. Ernie Capellar from Florida ended up finishing in 5th, and then Kujay Reddings, Barrett Cherokee, and Romeo Coloci rounded out the list. So now let's take a look at some of the other award winners before we get to the college football playoff. We'll start with the Maxwell Award. Our 3 candidates were Justin Tucker, Aram Ketchikan, and Puma Whitlock. Ultimately, the winner, by a pretty decisive margin, was unsurprisingly Duke quarterback Justin Tucker, who received 65 first-place votes, mine included. The Maxwell is another award for the best player in the country, but it's not exactly the Heisman Trophy. The Walter Camp is up next, and I decided to make the nominees the 3 best non-quarterbacks in the country: Dontavius Brown, MJ Hill, and Jabari Kruger. This one ended up being a landslide as well, with Baylor running back Dontavius Brown receiving 90 first-place votes. That's a lot, and it's very well deserved. The Bednarik and Nagurski Awards I put together as the best defensive player in the nation. It was down to Babatunde Mamadou, Yaya Mabuki, and Adrian Moore. Mamadou ended up winning the award, getting a little bit over half of the first place votes. I was one of the just 6 people to vote for Adrian Moore, but regardless, all 3 of them were spectacular this season. The Davey O'Brien went down to Kujay Reddings, Aram Kachakan, and Justin Tucker. Tucker won this one as well. I think Kujay Reddings should have been a little bit higher than only 11 votes, but again, Justin Tucker very much deserves that award. The Doak Walker for the best running back was down to MJ Hill, Dontavius Brown, and Mookie Davis. As good of a receiver as a guy like Mookie Davis is, the best pure running back in the country was far and away Dontavius Brown, who had to carry the Baylor offense this year, and he ends up winning multiple awards. The Fred Biletnikoff was down to Jabari Kruger, Sammy Wusus, and Luther Lexerus. By a wide margin, the best receiver in the country ends up being Jabari Kruger of Duke. He had the luxury of having Justin Tucker throw him the football, but you don't luck into the receiving Triple Crown. The John Mackey Award was down to Johnson Johnstone, Paxton Grebs, and Isaiah Deloach. Again, by a wide margin, Johnson Johnstone of UCLA ended up winning the John Mackey Award as the best tight end in the country. That'll bring us to the Outland Award for the best offensive lineman. That was down to Ray McLeod, a guard from Oregon, Nnamdi Olushanu, a tackle from Middle Tennessee State, and our ultimate winner, Dexter Longfellow, the left tackle of Alabama, who did not allow a single sack this year, getting 78 first-place votes. The Remington for the best center in the country was down to Neil Bennett, Darwin Glanton, and Teddy Cheeseburger. This ended up being by far the closest award race, with Neil Bennett of Notre Dame taking it home, getting 52 first-place votes. I personally voted for Teddy Cheeseburger, who had 29. The Lombardi was down to Yaya Mabuke, Adrian Moore, and Tony Adichie. By a pretty wide margin, Clemson pass rusher Yaya Yabuki ended up winning the award. I again voted for Adrian Moore. Mabuki's numbers across the board are a little bit better, so I don't really have a major complaint. The best linebacker award was down to Babatunde Mamadou, Raymond Leak of South Carolina, and Histan Stromboli of Auburn. The Buckus Award winner ends up being Babatunde Mamadou, the projected #1 pick in this year's draft. And finally, the Jim Thorpe Award was down to Kibani Smith-Gardner, Malachi Fultz, and Jeremiah Jones. Ultimately, Malachi Fultz of Kansas State ended up winning the award with 61 first-place votes, the closest deficit between first and second in any award race we had this season. A lot of the awards ended up being blowouts. However, that, as you'll see, was not the case with the college football playoff, and that's where we're going to be shifting our attention to next. Let's find out the 12 teams going to the playoff. We already know 6 teams that are in. The Power 5 conference champions and the highest-ranked Group 5 conference champion are automatically gifted playoff spots. Those teams are Florida, USC, Baylor, Virginia Tech, Cal, and Middle Tennessee State. They will occupy the top 4 seeds who get first-round byes. The teams on the right are the teams eligible to get an at-large bid, and of those 15 or so teams, there will be 6 of them who end up making the college football playoff. This year's playoff voting ended up being a lot closer across the board in comparison to last year's, which really did not surprise me a whole lot because I think the teams at the top of the country are a lot closer together in terms of talent than last year's, and I think there's more depth and more teams that are deserving to make the playoff in comparison to last year. And we had some very close battles decided by just a few points. So without further ado, I would like to welcome everybody to the 2024 College Football Playoff Reveal. We will be finding out the 12 teams, according to you guys, who deserve to make it into the playoff and what their seedings will ultimately be. The #1 overall seed this year will be the Florida Gators, the SEC champions. No major surprise here, as Florida ended up getting 94 of the possible 111 first-place votes. This is completely well-deserved. The Gators have been arguably the best team in the country this year, winning the SEC with a record of 12-1. They have not lost since Week 3 against Oklahoma. They are as hot as anybody, and they are as good as anybody with multiple signature wins on their schedule. They beat Alabama in Tuscaloosa to start the season. They blew out Georgia in Week 9. They blew out Florida State on the road in Week 14, and they took care of business in the SEC Championship, beating Alabama for a second time. Heisman contending quarterback Ernie Capellar has had a fantastic season for the Gators. He was a little bit disappointing last year in the college football playoff, but he'll get another opportunity with more expectations at the helm. The Gators have a lot of talented skill position players. Defensively, this team is one of the best teams in the conference. I'm not sure there is a more complete and battle-tested team right now in college football than the Florida Gators, and I really view them as the favorites to win the whole thing. The number 2 seed will be the California Golden Bears. Last year, California was a Cinderella team in the college football playoff, winning the Pac-12 when they weren't really good enough to make the playoff. But then they dominated their first-round game a year ago, beating Notre Dame 35-3 and only losing by 2 to the eventual national champion TCU Horned Frogs. This Cal team is a lot better than last year's team. They went 12-1, winning the Pac-12, and this team has gone through more adversity than just about anybody. In Week 2, their first game of the year, they lost to FCS Northwest. They fell all the way out of the rankings. But they have not lost a game since then, and they are the only team in the FBS to not lose to another FBS team this year. Against Washington, their starting quarterback, Rufus Motley, who was their starter last year in the playoffs, suffered an injury. They turned to backup Marquise Harris, and they have not looked back since then. Harris has dominated, and he led Cal to a dominant 41-13 victory in the Pac-12 championship over Washington. Now, Cal's got some questions to answer at the quarterback position because Rufus Motley, the guy who they've built their offense around and led them to the playoff last year, is now fully healthy. Do you turn to him, or do you give it to the hot hand, Marquise Harris, who has been unbelievable since coming in as the starter? Marquise Harris doesn't really fit the option-styled, run-heavy offense, but he's been so good to where you kind of just have to keep rolling with him. Defensively, Cal is very strong as well. And I think this team, from their experience last year and their adversity this year, they can take it all the way. The 3 seed is the USC Trojans of the Big Ten. USC was not expected to be here. They were a heavy underdog going into the conference championship game against Ohio State, and they dominated. They only ended up winning the game by 8 points, but if you watched the game, it was very clear that USC was considerably better than Ohio State, who is arguably the best overall team in the entire country. USC won 11 games this year, and things started off rocky for them as well. They lost their first game of the year to Indiana, who at the time we thought was pretty good. They ended up proving to be pretty fraudulent. They do have multiple big wins here. They beat a good Michigan State team on the road. They beat number 3 Oregon in Eugene. They lost to Stanford in overtime, tough team, but then they beat Notre Dame to clinch a spot in the conference championship, and obviously they won that game against Ohio State. USC is led by quarterback Scotty Kimbrell II, and we saw him dominate in the conference championship. They've got a young offense with guys like Monte Bradley, Squeezy Pryor-Escobar, and Tay Devine leading the way. USC hasn't been as consistent as some of these other teams at the top, but they're playing their best football down the stretch and look like they can be a threat to win it all. And finally, the 4th seed, the last team getting a first-round bye. The vote here was super close, and it was only decided by a few points, but ultimately, it's going to be Virginia Tech of the ACC. You can make the argument that the ACC was the best conference in the country this year, and it says a lot for Virginia Tech to be the team coming out of that conference. They obliterated Navy in the ACC championship, winning that game 29-0, and I think that game was a lot more based off of Navy's shortcomings. But even so, you can't discredit Virginia Tech. They played really well in that matchup, going 11-2 on the season after not even making a bowl game last year. They beat Florida State on the road. They only lost 2 games, one of which was to Washington, who's really good, and the other one was that ridiculous triple overtime game against Duke. With Duke losing the following week, Virginia Tech was able to hop into the conference championship, and they took advantage, obviously demolishing Navy. Quarterback DeAndre Jones, the junior, had a great season and could be a pretty high pick in next year's draft. They've got a multitude of weapons, and we saw defensively, this team is stingy and tough. They didn't allow any points in the ACC championship game. So last year what we did was we had the 6 automatic bids get the top 6 seeds. This year I decided not to do it like that because I thought it was unfair to the super high seeds. Let's take a look at last year's playoff bracket, for example. I think a team like Ohio State got completely screwed because they had to play Florida in the second round, whereas TCU only had to play Cal or Notre Dame. So because of that, the last 2 automatic bids, Middle Tennessee State and Baylor, I decided for them to be able to be seeded anywhere. We'll start with Middle Tennessee State, the 5th placed auto bid, I decided to give them the 8th seed, which means they will get to host a first-round game. Middle Tennessee went 12-1, narrowly defeating UAB in overtime in the American Athletic Conference Championship. And I think if they lost that game, they would not have ended up getting in with an at-large bid. Middle Tennessee State is the only team in this series to end up making the college football playoff in all 3 seasons. They're battle-tested, they're tough, and I think they really deserve this. They've beaten some good teams this year, like USF, Memphis. They beat UAB twice. Their only loss came in Week 13 to Southern Miss, where they got crushed, showing vulnerability and a lot of question marks. But they have answered those the past couple of weeks, and I think only losing 1 game in a very quietly really good conference deserved them a home game. I kind of had to make a judgment call with their seeding, and I think giving them the 8th spot is pretty fair. Middle Tennessee State won a playoff game last year. They've made it to the top 4 2 years in a row, but they haven't been able to get over the hump. Can this be the year? The final automatic bid team is Baylor, and again, I kind of had to make a judgment call with their seeding, so ultimately I decided to give them the number 11 overall seed. I didn't want to put them in last, but their resume is not better than anyone ahead of them, so I think putting them in 11th is fair. If this was last year, they would have been in 6th place and had a pretty easy first-round matchup. Baylor won the Big 12 in a ridiculous 4 overtime game, defeating Cincinnati in a matchup where they at one point trailed 20-3. Baylor is an old-school ground-and-pound football team. They can't really throw the ball, but they do everything else well. Their resume is very strong, and they have had some questionable games early in the year, barely beating BYU, getting killed by Vanderbilt, and losing to UConn. But since Week 8, they have been unstructable. And obviously that game against Cincinnati, they showed a lot of toughness and firepower down the stretch. This is not a team who can throw the ball at a high level. We saw Forrest Holloway play really well against Cincinnati, however, but this is Dontavius Brown's team, and along with Brown, they've got one of the best defenses in the entire country. Nobody gets to the quarterback more than Baylor, and most of their pass rushers are young guys, particularly freshmen, so I'm curious to see how they ultimately end up doing. So now this is where things get interesting. We knew these 6 teams would end up making the playoffs, but what about the other 6 spots? The 6 at-large bids. These last 6 teams are non-conference champions voted on by you guys to get in. We do not know who is going to make it of this group, so let's find out. We'll start with the number 5 overall seed, and that team is the University of Alabama. The Crimson Tide end up being the highest at-large bid team in the playoff. Of the at-large teams, I ended up voting them 3rd. I think there are some at-large teams who are a little bit better than them, but Alabama still certainly deserves this opportunity, getting 106 total votes of a possible 111. Alabama won 11 games this year. They took home the SEC West crown, and against teams not named Florida, they went undefeated. They have some good wins here. They beat Texas, a team who's eligible for a playoff spot. They beat Oklahoma in Week 13. I think that's their signature win to clinch their division. They do have some close wins here against bad teams like Texas A&M and Louisiana Tech. At quarterback, they have Troy Davenport, who got injured in the SEC championship game, but he is healthy and ready to go for the playoff. This is a run-first team, however, with Darius Coley and Tyon Christopher leading the fold, and defensively, these guys are very, very solid as well. I don't think Alabama deserved to be the top at-large bid team, but they absolutely deserve to be here nonetheless. The 6th seed and the team playing Baylor in the first round is going to be the Ohio State University. The Buckeyes come into the playoff with the highest point differential of anybody in the entire country at plus 300. To put that into perspective, Alabama's point differential is at around plus 120. Going into the Big Ten Championship, Ohio State was the clear favorite against USC, and they looked like they'd be one of the highest overall seeds in the playoff, but they lost that game, and they lost it pretty badly. Overall, the resume speaks for itself. Ohio State has been phenomenal this year, and I voted them as the number 1 at-large bid team in the country. They lost to Virginia in overtime, but other than that, they've beaten everybody else. Teams like Michigan State, Penn State, and Illinois. But that game against USC, they really struggled up until the 4th quarter, where they made a very impressive comeback effort, but it was a little too late. Puma Whitlock finished in 2nd for our Heisman Trophy voting. He was fantastic this year, along with guys like Mookie Davis out of the backfield. These are a dynamic duo, and the defense is great as well. Ohio State was my preseason national championship pick. And honestly, at this point, I'm not sure if I'm going to waver against that. I think Ohio State can match up with anybody in the country. Let's find out the number 7 seed and the final team who will get to host a first-round playoff game. And it's the Georgia Bulldogs of the SEC. Georgia won the college football playoff championship in season 1. Last year, they were the first team out. And this year, the Dogs are back. I voted them in second for the at-large bid spots behind Ohio State and ahead of Alabama. These 3 teams finished head and shoulders above all of the other at-large bid teams, and deservedly so. I think these are the 3 best non-conference champions in the country by a pretty wide margin. Georgia went 10-2, barely losing out on the SEC East. Their only losses this year are to Tennessee and then getting killed by Florida. They do have some good wins, though. They beat Oklahoma on the road pretty convincingly, and they have some other strong victories in there as well. Georgia's led by quarterback Aram Katchakan, who finished in 4th for the Heisman Trophy, and I personally voted him 2nd. They've got a lot of young guys on this offense with true freshman running backs, Miko Alexander and Marquise Edwards. Monty Grant leads a very talented receiving core, and defensively they're pretty strong as well, led by senior defensive linemen Tykeem Rogers and Dieter Jacobs. Georgia won the playoff last year. We know they had the capability to do it, but can they do it without guys like Patalomayo Maluwalu and Clyde Williamson? It's not a surprise that Alabama, Ohio State, and Georgia got in, but now we start to look at some of the teams on the bubble. Teams like Duke, Navy, Texas, Oregon, Oklahoma, Clemson, even Bowling Green. These are the teams who have been on the edge. Now it's time to see which teams of that group the committee preferred. With only 3 spots left to go in the college football playoff, there's not a lot of wiggle room for these teams. The 9th seed, who will be traveling to Middle Tennessee State? It's going to be the Duke Blue Devils, led by Heisman Trophy winner Justin Tucker. Now, I personally did not vote Duke in the top 12. They were my first team out. I thought some of the teams on the bubble were a little bit more complete than them, but selfishly, I'm pretty happy that you guys voted Duke in. Justin Tucker is must-watch box office television, and Duke is one of the most exciting teams in the country, despite their noticeable shortcomings on the defensive side of the ball. They lost to Miami big early in the season, but they rebounded after that. They beat Cincinnati, who's a good team. Look at how many points they scored per game. 49, 70 against Boston College, 45, 55, 49. They had the ridiculous win against Virginia Tech in overtime. After that game, all they had to do was win their Week 14 matchup, and they would have advanced to the ACC Championship, and they lost 58-53. Duke scores more points than anybody in college football, and quarterback Justin Tucker has shown that he can absolutely carry a team very far. Duke has won big games against great teams this year. Seeing that they had the Heisman Trophy winner at quarterback, I absolutely think this team can make a run. The problem is they're not a complete team at all. Defensively, they're really bad, and they have allowed close to 40 points per game. As fun as Justin Tucker is, and boy am I excited to see him in the playoff, I am a little bit worried Duke could get exposed possibly by a team like Florida in the second round, because Duke's defense is dookie, pun intended. So with that, we only have 2 spots left, the 10 seed and the 12 seed, and a lot of teams on the bubble who are absolutely deserving of those spots. Let's start with the 10th seed, who will be traveling to Athens to play against Georgia in the first round. It's going to be the Oregon Ducks of the Big Ten. So for a second straight season, the Ducks end up getting an at-large bid after going 10-2 this season. Oregon is led by senior quarterback Barrett Cherokee, and I think the fact that this Ducks team has a lot of experience from last year, they know what it's like to play and win in the playoffs. They beat Michigan in the first round, and they nearly beat Clemson in the second round, if not for a ridiculous game-winning Hail Mary at the end of the game by last year's Heisman Trophy winner, Cade Hutchinson. The Ducks did not win the Big Ten West, despite being the best team in that conference through the regular season at least. They did lose to USC, hence why they didn't get in, because they lost that game, and they also lost to UCLA. The Ducks lack true signature wins, but they did beat Notre Dame on the road in Week 12, which is quite impressive. Barrett Cherokee threw 40 touchdowns this year, and I think this Oregon roster is very complete. They have a good group of offensive skill position players, their offensive line is very good, and defensively they're sound and consistent as well. along with obviously having a very good quarterback, I think Oregon has the makings to be a possible surprise team who can make a run. Now, they've got to beat Georgia in the first round, and that's going to be a really tough game, but I think Oregon could outperform their spot. And with that, we only have one spot left to go, the number 12 seed, and interestingly enough, we ended up having a tie. Two teams finished with the exact same amount of points for the 12th seed. Basically, if you're unfamiliar with how my point system works, a first place vote nets 6 points, a second place vote nets 5 points, etc., etc. I think you guys get the point. So thankfully, in the event that we ever needed a tiebreaker, I had a list of tiebreakers ready and available. The first tiebreaker is the total number of votes given, not points, but overall just plain votes. And thankfully, the two teams who ended up tying had a different amount of votes. So let's find out who will be the number 12 seed and the final team in the playoff. It's going to be the Oklahoma Sooners. They will travel out to Alabama to face off against the Crimson Tide. So basically what happened in the voting was Oklahoma finished with 134 points and Navy finished with 134 points. However, Oklahoma ended up with more total votes, 50, rather than Navy, 45. So Oklahoma gets the spot over Navy. The Sooners went 9-3 this year, and in terms of their record, you can make the argument that they don't belong here. However, as you look at their schedule and their resume, I think they absolutely do. They're the only team to have beaten Florida. They beat Texas, and pretty much all of their other wins are blowouts. They lost to Georgia and they lost to Alabama late in the season. Those are two very good teams. They also lost to Tennessee, in which their starting quarterback, Romeo Coloci, was injured for that game. So I think you can kind of excuse them. While I totally understand the argument that a team that's 9-3 should not get a playoff spot over teams with 10, 11, and even 12 wins, but personally, I think you have to look a little bit past the record and look at how Oklahoma became 9-3. See all of their blowout wins. See that they're the only team to have beaten Florida this year. And you look at their losses. They lost to two great teams. And against Tennessee, they lost with a backup quarterback. So I personally believe that Oklahoma is extremely deserving to make it in. And I would not be surprised if they make a big run. They already played against Alabama earlier in the season. They can win that game. They can beat Virginia Tech. And from there, who knows? They already beat Florida this year. So let's take a look at the final results in terms of the overall voting. So again, Oklahoma and Navy had the same amount of points, but Oklahoma had 5 more votes than them. As for the other bubble teams, Clemson, who I voted as my 5th at-large bid, ahead of both Oregon and Duke, ended up finishing below everybody, including Navy. I thought Clemson deserved to get in. I believe they had the highest point differential in the ACC. They won 10 games this year, and they were really, really solid. I understand not putting them ahead of Navy because Navy beat Clemson, but I think Clemson's a better team, and I would say that's really my only gripe, Clemson not getting in. It seemed like there was a lot of love for the Group 5 teams. Bowling Green had some people who were really strongly behind them, and on one hand, I understand it. Bowling Green went 12-1. They won undefeated in conference play, and they won the MAC, which is not an easy conference at all. However, I personally believe that some of these Power 5 teams, even with worse records, like Oklahoma, for example, deserve to be ahead of them because Oklahoma's played against really good teams all year. And if you look at how Oklahoma lost, you can understand how their resume is a little bit stronger than their 9-3 record. So although I respect the opinions of everybody who was on the Bowling Green and Idaho train, I think the committee made the right choice by putting teams like Oklahoma ahead of them. I would say the only other really disrespected team was Florida State. I didn't think they deserved to get in, but they should not have been that far low. And this was the exact same thing with Florida State last year. I didn't think they deserved to get in, but I still thought they got quite a bit disrespected. So now we get a full look at our college football playoff bracket. We know the 12 teams who are in. We've got some really exciting matchups in the first round. Duke, Middle Tennessee State, Oregon, Georgia, Ohio State, and Baylor, and then Alabama and Oklahoma. The winners will obviously move on to the next round, which turns into neutral site bowl games. The tournament does not reseed. So, for example, let's say a team like Oklahoma ends up winning. They would play against Virginia Tech, not Florida. After we get to the Final Four, it's played at one neutral site, national championship, whatever. Hopefully that all makes sense. Very similar to last year's playoff, and you'll see how it goes as we go through the college football playoff episodes. So that's going to wrap it up. I appreciate everyone's opinions and input throughout this season and your votes within the poll. This has been a really fun season, and I'm really excited to see who our champion ends up being. We still have the other bowl games to go through. Those will be in the next episode. But then after that, we will start the college football playoff and find out who will win the national championship for Season 3 of the series.